Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this video, you have me immediately post-run, well almost immediately, starting another vlog. I think this will be the last, hopefully, the last weekly vlog with Goodreads Choice Awards books. The reason that I say hopefully is because I still have not gotten the Cassandra Clare book. It is said available soon for a week. It's because this hold, the one that I'm closest on, is at my local library and there's just one copy. And I guess whoever has it right now is taking their sweet time in reading it. And I'm next in line. So theoretically I could get it right now. Like it could come and, you know, while I'm filming this and I'd have the book. But I keep waiting and waiting and waiting. I am not going to spend an audiobook credit on it because I do not want to support Cassandra Clare financially for reasons. I'm not going to get into that. It is Wednesday and I am just now starting this vlog. Getting into that a little bit. It is finals week at school and that brings pretty much chaos because for the state testing, one class per course subject has a state test and they have to have 2.5 hours. And so we completely upend the entire schedule for these. Well, that's fun. And then yesterday, something weird went on with the internet where it wasn't the Wi-Fi going down. It was something about like security certificates or something. Obviously, if you have a security test, it's not going to work. So we had to upend the schedule again today for just about everyone. Most of the schedule was the same, except for if you had one of these tests in your fourth block. They went and tested, and what that meant was people like me who have first block planning, we got voluntold to go cover someone's class, and our rooms were taken for people who were kicked out of their rooms for testing. So that was fun. But just on days like these, on weeks like these, it takes a lot out. Mentally, psychologically, it's just a lot. Like you're not actively teaching, but you are trying to correct. It's like trying to herd cats with these children. It's already a bit of a nightmare with some of these freshmen, but then add in schedule changes and there are exams and certain teachers, I guess, are trying to take things easy and are showing movies already. And I'm like, I had students ask me, why are we watching a movie? And like, because you have an exam in 2 days. We are reviewing for your exam. Why? Why bother? You don't do anything anyway. Okay. Yes, am I a little cynical? That being said, I decided to wait until I had finished one of my books that I'm reading thus far to get my thoughts together on, because Monday I hadn't gotten very far in either of the books that I was reading. And then yesterday, I just did not. I did not feel like updating, even though I did have one. No, I was very, very close to finishing. I had like a half hour left on the audiobook. That's why I didn't, one of the reasons why I didn't update yesterday. Now, I've finished only one of them. I'm going to finish another one of the audiobooks tonight. I don't think I'm going to finish my ebook tonight. I might not, but I'll talk about all three of them. So the one that I finished is How to Say Babylon by Safia Sinclair. This is amazing. From the opening lines of this book, I was hooked into it. It's read by the author. She is a poet. And this is, I did look at it. I listened to it as an audiobook and I did look at it to see if it was written in verse. It's not, but it sounds like it. There's a quality to a poet's writing that will transfer over even when they're writing prose. I noticed this in How the Word is Passed with Clint Smith. Safia Sinclair tells an absolutely captivating story of her life growing up as the oldest daughter, the oldest child of a very strict, devout follower of Rastafarianism. It's very interesting because Rasta, as they call it, there's not anything defined about the religion. There are ideas that are followed by a lot. There are some general sects, you could call them, but how it plays out for each family is basically up to the father, husband of the family. And that leads to a lot of, let's just say, interesting outcomes. And I just was really captivated with this story. And she made so many incredible observations about her life, about the interaction of different familial relationships. She talked about discovering Babylon, which is basically like anything in the outside world, anything English, anything American, etc., anything Western. And she talks about this point where she does get to come to the United States to study in college and then in her master's. And she talks about looking at some of the things that she saw because she studied in Charlottesville. And she looked at a lot of the different aspects of life there and was like, oh wow, maybe this was what Dad was saying about Babylon, even though he did some rather abusive things. And it helped her shine a light on different aspects of history of the world and of her life. And it just was utterly captivating. I highly recommend this one. If I had read it earlier, I might have voted for this one, but it's really difficult. And again, I don't rate and I'm not going to rank the memoirs, but this is definitely one of the more successful ones. Then we come to the audiobook and the ebook. I do not have physical copies of either of them, and these were both ones that were not available in physical copy from my library and were very difficult to get a hold of. Like, I don't think I could get either an ebook or an audiobook of A Man of Two Faces, which is the one I'm reading ebook through Libby, but it was available on Hoopla. So I was able to get the ebook of that, and that's how I'm reading that. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Audiobook wise, I'm listening to, I almost said A Living Remedy. No, The Witching Year by Diana Helmuth. So I'm going to talk about that one first, go audiobooks, and then my physical reading. I'm going to finish that very soon. I'm not a fan of this kind of book. Like, it's fine. I like the concept, the idea. She mentions, I think in the prologue or whatever set at the beginning of the book, that it's styled after she took inspiration from A.J. Jacobs. Oh, yes, she did. She talked about it. She took inspiration from A.J. Jacobs' book, The Year of Living Biblically. I have read a book by A.J. Jacobs, and it's a project type book where they set off to do something. In that one, he set off to read the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, and he was documenting his journey through that. In the book, A Year of Living Biblically, I haven't read that, but what he does, his project, is to live according to the exact things mentioned in the Bible. I guess maybe Hebraic law and Deuteronomy. I haven't read the book, so I don't know exactly. Diana Helmuth, I guess, has done other books like this where she's taken a project and explored things throughout it. And in this one, what she's doing is she's taking a year and she's basically living as or investigating being a witch as a religion, which, interesting concept. I don't really vibe with the project idea because she's mentioning like these days along and maybe things that happen. And yes, there are threads that go through it. One of the things talked about are different effects from the pandemic and the lockdown, because that's when this book started. I think in 2020, late 2020, early 21. I don't remember exactly when it started. But this is a book steeped in the pandemic. She also talks about her relationship with her boyfriend. She talks about some back pain that she had. She talks about relationships with her mom. But it's all focused in the lens, in the format of this framework. That's the word I wanted. Of this year of like witchy stuff. And it's not clear whether she believes it or not. Like, she says she's trying to believe it, but when you think that it's a project and you're trying to believe it, are you actually following through? It's not as engaging. It's not the life story. It's not the sharing that I don't know. There's an aspect of memoir that I really appreciate, getting to learn a person's story. And I think when you have a book like this, you're not really learning their story because it is filtered through the lens of this project that they're doing. It's not their story. So I think that's what's throwing me off about this one. I think when I finish this Goodreads project, because I think I have 3 more not including the ebook. I think, unfortunately, Becoming Free Indeed, which does a similar thing. It's not a memoir. It was miscategorized. Page Boy and this one, if I were going to rank them, I would rank lowest. Two of them, Becoming Free Indeed by Ginger Dargaruolo, and this one, The Witching Year, because I don't think they're memoirs. I don't know what category you would put them in, not in memoir. Page Boy, because the nonlinear storytelling did not work for me. Thankfully, out of all of the categories that I have read, I have had so many more hits with memoir. It's fantastic. Speaking of fantastic, one that is a format that, on the face of it, based on what I said about Page Boy, you would think would not work for me. And that is A Man with Two Faces. And I don't know the correct pronunciation of his name, but I do have his Pulitzer Prize winning, I think it's Pulitzer Prize winning, novel, The Sympathizer, on my TBR to read. I probably will read that next year. He has a very captivating way of telling the story. And I don't know if his narrative is the same in his memoir as in the novel, but what he does, he's not really telling it in first person. If I'm remembering correctly, he's using second person and or third person and taking this sort of a lens that pulls back on his life and sets different pieces of his life within context of the different history and cultural events that happen along his life. And on some of them, he'll take the through line up until the present. And I think he does have some first person in there, because I remember that because he sometimes talks about his son. But it's a mix of those, which on the surface shouldn't work for me. And there are parts where, like, it's not the one that has resonated with me the most or one that I could say I enjoyed the most, but it's such a fascinating experiment, or I don't know what the word I want is. The way he's playing with this narrative and actually telling his story, I think is another aspect of telling his own story, the way he's doing it. And I love it. There have been so many quotes, because I'm reading this in the chair by my computer, or I have the past 2 nights, and so many times I've had to set down my Kindle and like pull up in my messages and type a quote from what I'm reading and send it to my mom, because it is that powerful. The way his actual narrative is phenomenal. And one thing that I love, because it's similar to something that I have done. The previous administration, I make a fairly conscious effort to not name the head of that previous administration. It's my choice, and there are reasons. I just, one of them being, it gives me the ick. And also, names have power. But in this book, it is so, I snorted with laughter. I love it. The censor marks, every single time that name would go in there, there's the censor marks. Like, it's not even covering up the words. It's just that thick black line. And you know exactly what it's supposed to be, which I love. It's not necessarily going to be my favorite, but I love the exploration in the style of memoir. It's not something that I really would have picked up otherwise. And it's not a style that I am familiar with. And it works for me in a way that Page Boy's style did not. They're not the same thing. Yes, they are both told non-linearly, but this author of The Man of Two Faces does it so much better. Well, I don't know if Elliot Page had a ghostwriter or not, but the author of Man of Two Faces, that is what he is known for. That is how he makes his living, and he's won a Pulitzer Prize. Even if the ghostwriter of Page Boy, obviously, they do that for a living, not necessarily on the same level. So I'm really enjoying that one. Not so much The Witching Year, but as of right now, the books that I have left, one on adult fantasy, Swordcatcher. Really want to get a hold of that, please. On young adult fantasy, I have 2, A Curse for True Love and The House of Marion. I have the audiobook for A Curse of True Love. That is, as of right now, the only audiobook I have queued up for my list. I'm hoping for a few more to come in. Then on the memoir side, besides the 2 that I'm in the middle of, well, one I'm in the middle of, one I've almost finished. Besides those 2, I have They Call This Exceptional, I have Hijab Butch Blues, and there's one more that I cannot remember. But I do have physical copies of those 3. So if worse comes to worse, I can read those physically if I'm not able to get a hold of them via audiobook. That means 6 books. Actually, if I'm thinking about this, I don't think there's any others besides that. It might actually be only 2. I'm going to go check real quick. Yeah, it is. Only 2 more, which brings the total to 5 that I have not started yet. Obviously, the biggest of which is Swordcatcher. So, Swordcatcher, House of Marion, A Curse for True Love, They Call This Exceptional, and Hijab Butch Blues. And that's it. I looked at my story graph to see when I finished last year's challenge. And of course, I had the Keeper of the Lost Cities series that took so long to finish because I had 9 books to read in that I didn't really count it. I called it complete when I'd finished everything else. End of December is when I was finishing with all of those last year, like December 27th. And I might be done by the 16th. Let's see if I get Swordcatcher. Because if I have to read that physically, it's not going to get done as soon. Hopefully, by the next time I update, I will have gotten Swordcatcher. Okay, I'm coming on for a quick update because I have been slowing down my reading. I'm getting to the point where I want to finish off my last handful of Goodreads books, which I listed in the last clip, but I'm really struggling in getting a hold of them. And it's Friday now, I still have not gotten that Cassandra Clare. Available soon. No. Over a week is not soon. Just because I'm first in line does not mean I'm going to get it anytime soon. Anyway, I have been slowing down a bit. I have been catching up on YouTube, my watch later, etc. So I finished only 2 books since the last time we talked. Yes, I know that for most people, finishing 2 books in 2 days, that's a lot. At the point where I had updated last, I still had about an hour or so of The Witching Year to finish. And my thoughts remain generally the same. It was fine. Do I know if she wanted to actually follow witchcraft? She talks about that briefly, but doesn't come to a conclusion. And I stand by my statement that these whole project type memoirs are not really my favorite. The other memoir that I have finished, I was reading a chunk every night on ebook, is A Man of Two Faces. And a little bit later, he confirms my hypothesis about why he addresses he uses the second person in a lot of how he writes. And he's like, I can't bring myself to write about me, so I have to resort to using second person and putting it off of himself so that he can talk about some of these things. And he talks about a lot throughout the book. And at the time of the last update, I'd read about 50%. And obviously there's a whole lot more that he talks about in this book, and it is just a fascinating look at the immigrant experience and the refugee experience, I should say. The immigrant and refugee, and the combination and the weaving together of these different life experiences. It's fascinating. I definitely recommend this book, but I don't think that a lot of people will vibe with it. It's not a straightforward memoir. He's not a well-known person, and he's not saying things that a lot of people who look like myself are comfortable with hearing, but things that are the truth. Things about how others have been treated. These others who were made refugees because of the actions of a lot of people from our country, and then they go over to that country for safety and yet are ostracized and made other because of the problem that we made. It's a really fascinating look, and I really like that book. I have started 2 more on physical. I mean, A Man of Two Faces was ebook, but physically I have started They Call This Exceptional. I did have some audiobook holds, but it was a while out, so I figured that'll be the next one that I read. It is a much denser narrative style than some of the other books that I've been reading, memoirs that I've been reading. But I really like that I get to continue on with that aspect of the immigrant experience, because They Call This Exceptional is, I think she's Canadian. They immigrated. She's Canadian by birth. Her family, her parents immigrated. Her grandparents on her dad's side immigrated from India. And her mom was the bride, the arranged bride of her dad, and came from India. So she's second generation on one side, first generation on the other. There was this part in what she's talking about where her grandfather, her dad's dad, when he was coming over, he did this sort of experiment, and I don't remember the details of it, but basically to see whether it was going to be America or Canada and how things became available to them, what he was able to do, etc. And life was a whole lot easier for them in Canada. So he's like, nope, no to America, yes to Canada, which is a fascinating look. And I did it a disservice in my description of that. But because it is so dense, in a really good way, it's got a lot to chew on. But because of that, it is a slower read than A Man of Two Faces and the last book that I read physically. And I'm trying to remember what that was. And I don't, How to Save Babylon. I knew there was another immigrant experience, person of color memoir that I had been reading. And sadly to say, none of those made the top 10 in memoirs. Food for thought. As far as audiobook goes, obviously I am still waiting on Swordcatcher. I may end up reading that physically. I really don't necessarily want to because it is so long, but I will if I have to. I have gotten the audiobook of The House of Marion. That'll be my next read, but I have started A Curse for True Love. And I love Stephanie Garber's writing. And I think about the fact that last month I read Caraval and didn't necessarily love it. And I just realized I do have A Curse for True Love physically, but I think it's still on my TBR cart. I'm gonna go grab it. So this is the Goldsboro special edition. I love her writing in this series and I love the story. And when I think back on Caraval, I don't know what didn't work for me in that story. I mean, there were things that I could nitpick about if I'm trying to think back and remember. But there are things that I could nitpick about this story that are very similar. But for me, it works in here and it didn't work there. Now, yes, in the Caraval series, at least in the first book, you have the conceit, the trope of the carnival, of the magical carnival that appears for only a certain period of time. I think I've discovered that that's not necessarily my favorite. I don't remember the night circus, but my records show that I rated it 3 stars. And so maybe that was what didn't do it for me in that series, amongst other things. But this one really works. And I remember last year just falling head over heels for this series, for the relationship in this series. What happened to Evangeline at the end of that second book, it gutted me. I think that we ended with the narrative point of view of Jax. I really wish that I could both read the books right after they come out and not forget these key pieces of it, these key feelings for when I come into the second book. Because it's not like I've forgotten what happened in that book. I remember, but there are details. There are bits of the plot and how that ending unfolded that I do not remember, which puts me in an interestingly similar position to Evangeline at the start of this story. And usually that trope I hate. I usually hate that trope, but I think it's working in here. Now, I'm not very far, but I'm still loving it. And I'm probably going to finish it tomorrow. Well, I am going to finish it tomorrow on my run because I've got 20 miles and I have less than 2 hours of the audiobook. So this is definitely going to be a win. Would it have been my vote? No. I still would have voted for the book that I voted for. I still think that's the best out of those 20 books, but this is another win from what I think just vibes was not a good list for me. I'll get more into that in my reflection. I am really hoping to wrap up these books soon so that I can do my reaction and comparing the Goodreads sorting to my sorting and the overall selection now that I've had a while to look at all of these books, to think about a lot of different issues like representation and etc. that I wasn't thinking in the spur of the moment reaction videos. I hope to bring maybe 1, possibly 2 more updates to this vlog, which is going to be shorter because my reading is slowing down. I think I can manage to finish everything except for Swordcatcher and maybe one and a half of the memoirs. And hopefully next week I'll be able to finish the rest. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up the vlog in this clip. I had thought about maybe doing a clip today, Saturday, and another clip Sunday, but I realized with all that I need to do tomorrow, I need to film several things because I just did not have the energy for that today, that I'm not gonna get as much reading done. Yeah, so speaking of today, I was really tired when I woke up, and so I literally leaned into the rest and prepping myself because I had 20 miles on the plan. Interestingly, there were some cyclists that passed us at one point. Well, we had both come to a stop at one of the road crossings, and the lady asked us how many miles we were running, which made me think that they had seen us, like passed us going the other way. I hadn't been paying attention to them, and then we were still out running. And I said 20, and she's like, oh, you guys training for a marathon? And I said, yeah. And she asked which one, and I told her Houston, and she wished us good luck. So it was a nice exchange. Then speaking of, my brain is everywhere right now, but we stopped at Starbucks on the way back. And it's the Starbucks that we always come back to, but because Houston is flat, we've been driving downtown so that we cut out the really ridiculous hills closer to my house. And so usually we've walked into the Starbucks to pick up our drinks and then keep going. And the baristas at Starbucks, they know us, they expect us on Saturday mornings. But obviously we drove up this time and neither of us felt like getting out of the car. And the barista asked us, oh, no running today? So of course he's gonna assume that because we're driving up, but it's kind of funny to have run 20 miles and someone's like, oh, no running today? Oh no, we definitely ran today. And I'm going to have to continue this in a moment after I change out the battery. This probably is going to be a little bit disjointed because my brain is everywhere. So yeah, after running 20 miles, I was really tired, took it slow, had showered and had thought about filming some of the stuff today, but then realized my hair was still damp and wet from the shower and decided I'll let it dry while I read, and that ended up being like 2.5 hours or so because I think I dozed off a little bit, understandably so. All that to say, I'm gonna wrap up in this clip and talk about the 2 books that I finished today. I started both of them previously, and the one book that I started. Speaking of the one book that I started, I finished one of my audiobooks on the run. I knew a little bit before halfway I would finish A Curse for True Love. And so I had already made sure to have the audiobook for House of Marion. And because the waitlist still said 4 or 5 weeks, I went ahead and used one of the credits that I had saved up on this. And so we're still running, but I get my phone out while we're running to switch the audiobooks. And as I look at the lock screen, I see a notification from Libby. And I got so excited thinking that it was Swordcatcher because that's been saying available soon for over a week. No, it was this one that was apparently available from the library. Literally, when my Swordcatcher hold said available soon, first said available soon, there were like 5-6 weeks left on the hold for this book. Please explain how I get that one before one that said available soon for over a week. I need that book. That's going to end up being the last book that I read for this whole thing. Am I a little bit frustrated about that? Yes. So speaking of the book that I finished, A Curse for True Love, I loved this. I knew that I would love this. And I'd heard reviews from people saying that the way that Stephanie Garber resolved the trope that I hate, I almost said it out loud, worked really well. And that the way that everything wrapped up also worked really well and they enjoyed it. So I was glad, relieved a little bit to fall into those same camps. My one negative is that I wanted more. I wanted more. I should get the other books to see what the length compares to, but I don't feel like getting up and getting those. But it just felt like there was not quite enough with the story. It went by almost too fast. All of the things that happened in this particular book made sense. And I don't think that rearranging where the second book ended would have worked well, because having that cliffhanger there was crucial, I think, in setting up this third book. I think that was used very well. I just wanted more. I will say that the stakes felt like they got a little bit muddled in this one, but not terribly. I still think that my favorite of the trilogy is actually the second book, and it's not often that a second book in a series is the favorite, but I think the way that Stephanie Garber developed the relationships, it flowed really well. It made a lot of sense, and I enjoyed it. I do question a little bit her having perspectives from Apollo, but they weren't terrible. I do love Apollo's ultimate end because it was like he got what he deserved. And when that shift started to happen, I'm like, oh, I know what's happening here. Ah, yes, that's perfect. Is it a tragic ending? Technically, but was it well-deserved? And the way that she ended this story definitely left the door wide open for future books in this world. It kind of made me interested in reading the other two books in the Caraval series, where some of the background to the Fates is laid out, because that's not present in Caraval in the first book at all. I think this was a satisfactory ending. I loved the way ultimately that the relationships came together. I think there were a few missing pieces that she could have expanded on, made this book a little bit bigger, and made it the perfect book. But still, highly satisfying conclusion. I think, I'm not quite sure, but I think this might end up as second or third in my ranking of all of the choices on the list. At this point, I've read so many of them, I don't remember all of the ones that I read. The one that I finished physically is They Call Us Exceptional by Prachi Gupta. At first, I was really drawn in and compelled to learn more about her story. I will correct one thing that I said previously. While most of her family does live in Canada, I don't remember how, but she and her brother grew up in the US, in Pennsylvania. At different times, they ended up living in Canada. I don't remember that part. But what I told you before about her grandfather, her father's father, choosing whether or not to live in the US or Canada, that story was in there. I just mistakenly assumed at the point that I was trying to recall that she also grew up in Canada. She did not. As this got into her adulthood though, it just kept going over the same sorts of trauma and these different things that would happen, but it felt like she was vague tweeting about it. Obviously she wasn't tweeting, but she really never gets into the heart of the issues or even works on herself at all or acknowledges her part in the role. She does end up making herself seem like a victim a lot, and I get that. But at the same time, she never says anything definitive about her other family members and how that ended up playing out. There's a lot of tragedy that happens in here. There's probably significant undiagnosed mental illness in a couple members of her family, maybe in herself, maybe in all of her family, which, you know what, in just about every family there probably is. But the things that, like, her father especially acted on and did was absolutely terrible. And yet no one ever questioned that and investigated and figured out why he was doing those sorts of things and causing those horrendous problems. And nothing ends up resolving. And I was left, it felt anticlimactic. And another thing that bothered me a little bit about the writing, especially at first, when I first noticed it, was I think this was supposed to be a letter to her mother. And at various times, she would use second person, addressing the you, like addressing her mother. But she would go for pages and pages and pages without addressing her mother, and then it would come up and it would have the you. And of course, as you're reading it, you're like, you? And it seems like it's the reader. And then I was like, oh, wait, that's supposed to be her mother. So it was a little bit jarring in the fact that she didn't structure the whole narrative with that, but only parts of it. I feel heartbroken for her and all that she's had to endure, but at the same time, this just didn't end up giving all that much, which is one of the things that makes reading a lot of memoirs complicated and why I have decided to not rate memoirs, because obviously I'm not going to rate this one. So then I will talk briefly about House of Marion. I am not very far into it. I'm only about an hour or so into the audiobook. So far, it's fine. I'm mildly intrigued by the magic system set up in here, but I'm seeing a lot of what feels like copycat of other magical schools, especially Hogwarts, only twisted and made like Southern and with debutantes, which is kind of like, okay. There's a point in here where her grandmother is saying that magic had to be kept hidden for hundreds and hundreds of years, but then we finally got this, like, society evolved to a point where we could use debutante bells to hide our magic. I'm like, why would you have to wait for debutante balls and that whole cotillion and etc.? I'm like, wow, doesn't make much sense to me. There are other things that you could have done to mask this system. That part doesn't make sense to me. But on the surface, it's fine. I've met what I assume to be the love interest. It's typical YA fantasy in that regard. This is urban fantasy, as in it's like more modern. It's not in a magical world. It opens in, I think, New Orleans. I don't know where the house itself is supposed to be. I don't know what I'll end up thinking at the end of this, but I'm not far enough into it to have more concrete thoughts. So I will probably end up finishing this on Monday. I hope. Hopefully by that point I will have Swordcatcher. If I don't, yeah, that's gonna be a problem. I think I'm going to keep up with the vlog style of recent reads. Obviously I'm not gonna have a lot of, or any B-roll. I've never had any B-roll. That's just not really how I roll. But I think I'm gonna keep it up, because waiting until the end of the week and doing recaps and summaries and feelings on every single book for the week, it just was a lot. And it ended up with me thinking, I don't want to do this. Do I end up doing massive recaps in chunks? Kind of, yes. But maybe I'll make it a daily thing. Maybe I won't. It'll just depend on my reading speed and those sorts of things. But I think I'm going to keep it up. But obviously this is the last of these weekly vlogs where everything that I've read has been for the Goodreads Choice Awards list. I have 2.5 books left. Marion, House of Marion, Swordcatcher, and Hijab Butch Blues. So one from each category. I think, because I'm reading this on audiobook, I think young adult fantasy will be the first category that I finish. Unless I decide to sit down and read for hours physically, and then memoir will be the first that I finish. We shall see. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.